Welcome to the Sleepy Heaven, a place where the worries of the day fade away and we explore stories pulsing with universal lessons. I'm your host, John, and I'm happy you are here. Tonight, we walk the worn stone paths of ancient Athens, where philosophy is not just spoken but lived, where wisdom is not merely sought but discovered in the quiet spaces between words. In the flickering glow of oil lamps, beneath the vast Athenian sky, we will explore a tale of friendship, time, and the roads we choose to walk or abandon. We will follow Nicander, a man caught between past regrets and the hope of reconciliation, as he rediscovers the value of a friendship nearly lost. Guided by the words of Plato, we will witness how time, though it may wear down memories and distant souls, can never fully erase the bonds once nurtured. The roads of the heart, like those of the city, may become overgrown, but with patience and effort, they can be walked once more. So find a quiet place to listen, and let yourself be carried into this story, where wisdom is found in hushed conversations, where the stars bear witness to reflection, and where, in the end, no path is ever truly lost to those willing to walk it again.
Close your eyes and take a deep, slow breath. Feel it settle within you, bringing clarity and presence. As you exhale, release the weight of distance and time, letting go of the hesitations that have kept you from walking down an overgrown path of friendship. Imagine the moments that have shaped you, much like the lessons passed down in whispered conversations. A shared laughter long ago, a gesture of kindness, an unspoken promise of loyalty. These memories are the columns that uphold the temple of your friendships. Though time may have worn them, their foundation remains strong. With every breath, feel gratitude for the journeys you have taken, for the friends who have walked beside you, and for those you were willing to seek once more. Take a final moment to simply be seated in the quiet of an ancient home, beneath the Athenian sky, where wisdom is shared and friendships endure. With each breath, let yourself carry forward the lesson of the night. No path is ever truly lost, as long as one chooses to walk it again.
The warm breeze of Athens meandered through the gardens of Plato's home, where the philosopher often welcomed his closest disciples for informal gatherings. Tonight, they were not convened by the solemnity of the academy, but by something more personal: friendship, an invisible bond strengthened through conversation and shared laughter. A small group of men, both young and experienced, sat in the interior courtyard beneath the sprawling shade of a fig tree. Among them were Speusippus, Hermocrates, and a few others, their expressions a mix of curiosity and contemplation. A low wooden table in the center bore cups of wine, bowls of olives, and dried figs. The night was peaceful, interrupted only by the distant song of crickets and the soft murmur of voices. The flickering light of oil lamps cast elongated shadows on the stone walls, giving the moment a timeless quality. The scent of warm earth mixed with the faint fragrance of jasmine, creating an atmosphere that felt almost sacred in its serenity. Nicander, a bright-eyed young man with an inquisitive nature, broke the quiet moment. "Master, why have you invited us here rather than the academy?" Plato, his usual calm demeanor unwavering, took a sip of wine before replying. "Because tonight is not about lessons or debates. It is about something more essential: friendship. We often discuss justice, virtue, and the nature of the soul, But do we not forget that what sustains us in times of doubt and hardship is the companionship of those we call friends? A thoughtful silence followed as the disciples exchanged glances. Some nodded, while others reflected inwardly on their teacher's words. A breeze stirred the leaves above them, whispering through the branches as if the fig tree itself agreed with the sentiment. The bonds between us, Plato continued, are like paths worn into the earth by frequent travel. If we neglect them, the grass will grow, and soon the road will be lost. The metaphor hung in the air, its simplicity carrying profound weight. A few disciples shifted in their seats, considering their own friendships, wondering how many paths they had let become overgrown. A dog, a stray that often lingered near Plato's home, padded across the courtyard and curled up beside the table, a silent reminder of the comfort of companionship. The flickering oil lamps reflected in its tired eyes, a symbol of the quiet endurance of those bonds that persist despite neglect. Speusippus, always eager to probe deeper, leaned forward. Master, you teach us that philosophy is the love of wisdom. Is not friendship also a form of love? Plato smiled. It is. Not the love that leads to momentary pleasures, but the noble love that nurtures the soul. A true friend helps us understand ourselves, challenges us to be better, and stands beside us without envy or resentment. The students mulled over these words as the evening air carried the fragrance of blooming jasmine. The wine loosened tongues, and soon conversation flowed with greater ease. A distant lyre could be heard from a neighboring house, its soft melody weaving into the night's contemplative air. The sky stretched dark and endless above them, stars beginning to peek through the deepening twilight. For a time, the group sat in silence, each contemplating their own friendships. Some thought of companions they had not seen in many months. Others recalled childhood friends now distant, lost not to anger but to the slow erosion of time and neglect. Nicander shifted in his seat, hesitating before speaking. Master, he asked finally, is it possible that one may feel a friendship without realizing it? Plato observed him thoughtfully. Yes, Nicander. A friendship does not end in an instant, but in a series of small, unnoticed moments. A missed visit, an unanswered message, an assumption that there will always be time later. And then one day, the path is no longer there. A quiet sigh escaped one of the older students, his gaze lowered. I have let the grass grow, he murmured, half to himself. There are friends I have not spoken to in years. Plato nodded. We all have, at some point. But the path can still be cleared if one has the will to walk it again. The fire in the courtyard burned lower, crackling softly as a gentle wind stirred the embers. The night deepened, but the warmth between them did not fade. There was no great proclamation or grand realization, only a quiet certainty that something important had been acknowledged. That night, without lengthy treatises or formal discourse, Plato imparted a lesson that would stay with them forever. The gathering was more than a philosophical discussion. It was a living testament to the idea that one must never let the grass grow on the path of friendship. The days following the gathering at Plato's home were filled with contemplation for many of the disciples. The words of their teacher had planted a seed, one that grew in quiet reflection. As the sun cast its golden glow over the streets of Athens, Nicander walked alone, his mind restless with the question he had posed that night: could one fail a friendship without realizing it? The agora bustled with merchants and philosophers alike. The scent of fresh bread mingled with the sharper aroma of oil and spices. Stalls lined the wide stone streets, displaying baskets of figs and dates, amphorae filled with fragrant oils, and fine textiles shimmering under the sun. The voices of merchants called out to passing customers, their words a blend of offers and persuasion. The rhythmic clang of metal striking metal from a nearby blacksmith's forge punctuated the hum of conversation. Nicander weaved through the crowd, barely noticing the greetings from familiar faces. He was searching, though he did not yet know for whom. He stopped at the steps of a modest home, one he had not visited in some time. The wooden door, once well maintained, showed signs of neglect. Dust clung to the edges, and the hinges creaked as he hesitated before knocking. The courtyard was overgrown, weeds sprouting between the cracks of the stone path leading to the door. A long moment passed before the door opened slightly, revealing a man not much older than himself, yet whose tired eyes bore a weight Nicander did not recall. "Philomenes," Nicander greeted, his voice careful. He could see the hesitation in his old friend's gaze, a mixture of surprise and something unreadable. The man before him blinked before offering a small, tired smile. "Nicander, it has been some time." "Yes, it has," Nicander admitted, shifting slightly. He had thought of what he might say, but now words felt clumsy in his mouth. I should have come sooner." Philomenes leaned against the doorway, regarding him with a guarded expression. "The road between us used to be well traveled." Nicander felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. "I let the grass grow," he murmured, echoing the lesson Plato had given them. "I did not mean to." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant shouts of traders and the occasional bray of a donkey. The midday sun cast sharp shadows, emphasizing the lines of worry on Philomene's face. Finally, Philomene sighed and stepped back. "Come in. The past cannot be walked again, but perhaps the path forward can be cleared." Relief flooded through Nicander as he stepped inside. The room was modest, filled with the scent of old parchment and ink. A small oil lamp flickered in the corner, casting dancing shadows against the walls. Scrolls were stacked haphazardly on a wooden shelf, their edges curled from time and use. The space, though small, bore the marks of a thoughtful mind. Scraps of papyrus filled with notes lay scattered across a table, a worn-out quill resting among them. As they sat, conversation began hesitantly but grew in warmth. The gaps left by time were acknowledged, but not dwelled upon. Nicander spoke of the gathering at Plato's home, of the lesson they had discussed, and how it had made him think of Philomenes. His friend listened, nodding slowly, his fingers tracing patterns on the rim of a clay cup filled with watered wine. "The road may be overgrown," Philomene said at last, his voice quiet, but it was never truly lost. The night deepened, and laughter, hesitant at first, soon found its place between them once more. The glow of the oil lamp softened the hard edges of their surroundings, bathing the room in a warmth that had been absent for too long. Outside, the city continued its rhythmic pulse, unaware of the quiet reconciliation taking place within the modest walls of Philomene's home. Meanwhile, at the academy, Plato observed the empty spaces at the usual gathering place. He did not need to ask to know where Nicander had gone. He had seen the unrest in his students' eyes and knew that the lesson had not fallen on deaf ears. A gentle wind stirred the leaves outside, rustling through the trees that lined the courtyard of the academy. Plato watched the sky darken, stars emerging in a slow, deliberate procession. He clasped his hands behind his back, his gaze distant. "The road between friends can be lost," he murmured to himself, watching as the evening wind stirred the leaves. "But only if both travelers abandon it." With a small nod, he turned back to his own work, satisfied that the lesson had begun its quiet work in the hearts of his students. The days in Athens drifted by like petals on a slow-moving stream. The heat of summer had begun to wane, and the crisp air of autumn carried the scent of ripe olives and damp earth. Nicander found himself lingering in the streets more often, watching the city as if trying to grasp the changes that had occurred in his absence. The rhythms of daily life continued. The merchants still called out their wares, the philosophers still debated in the stoa, and the artisans still carved marble into likenesses of gods and heroes. Yet, for Nicander, something had shifted. The city felt familiar, yet distant, as though time had reshaped it while he had been preoccupied with his own thoughts. Word had begun to spread. Plato would soon return from a brief journey beyond the city. The news stirred something in Nicander's chest, an unease he could not quite name. It had been some time since their last discourse at the academy, and though he had taken his master's words to heart, there remained a lingering question: had he done enough? He found himself back at Philomene's home more frequently, their conversations no longer hesitant but flowing like a stream unblocked by debris. They spoke of childhood memories, of shared adventures and mistakes that once seemed insurmountable. The scent of burning oil lamps mingled with the subtle aroma of parchment and ink, a constant reminder of the knowledge both had pursued in their own ways. Yet Nicander could not shake the feeling that there was still something left unspoken between them, a hesitation beneath their laughter. It was a silence that carried weight, not of anger, but of time left unaccounted for. One evening, as the sky burned with the last hues of the setting sun, Nicander finally voiced his thoughts. "Do you ever wonder," he asked Philomene, "if some friendships are beyond repair?" Philomene was silent for a moment, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his wine cup. The quiet stretch between them, filled only by the distant hum of Athens settling into the night. "I used to think so," he admitted. "But perhaps it is not the friendship itself that fades beyond repair, but the will to restore it." Nicander nodded, his gaze drifting toward the distant silhouette of the Acropolis. Plato spoke of paths overgrown, he murmured. But I wonder, do all roads lead back to where they began? Philomenes smiled faintly. Maybe they don't. But they lead somewhere if one chooses to walk them. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of temple bells, signaling the approach of night. The city seemed to exhale, its bustle giving way to the quiet murmurs of evening. Torches flickered along the streets, their flames licking the cool air as shopkeepers closed their stalls and weary travelers made their way home. The world, in its endless motion, continued, heedless of the personal dilemmas of two men seeking to bridge the past. At the academy, Plato's return was met with hushed discussions and eager anticipation. His absence had been short, but in his students' eyes, it had stretched like a shadow over their days. When he finally arrived, his presence was met with an unspoken reverence. He carried himself with the ease of one who had seen much and judged little, his gaze thoughtful as he took in the faces of his gathered pupils. The flickering torches cast a golden hue upon the stone columns, making them seem taller, more enduring, more timeless. Plato wasted little time with pleasantries. "Tell me," he said, his voice calm yet probing, "what have you learned in my absence?" The students hesitated, exchanging glances. Nicander, standing among them, felt a weight settle in his chest. He had spent these days reflecting, repairing, and understanding, but had he truly learned? His mind raced through moments spent with Philomenes, the questions that lingered in the air, the silences that spoke volumes. Finally, he stepped forward. "I have learned that friendship, like philosophy, requires effort," he said. "That it is not enough to think upon it, to long for it. One must act." Plato studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Indeed," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "One must not merely admire the road, but walk it." The words settled over the gathering like the first breath of autumn, a quiet shift, a promise of change yet to come. The students murmured in agreement, their own reflections bubbling beneath the surface. As the night stretched on, discussion continued in hushed tones, weaving philosophy with personal experience as it had always done in Plato's presence. The stars above bore witness to their contemplation, unchanged by the passage of time, constant in their quiet glow. Dawn broke over Athens with the soft glow of golden light spilling onto its rooftops. The scent of the sea drifted through the air, mingling with the distant sounds of merchants setting up their stalls. The narrow streets, paved with smooth stones worn by generations of travelers, shimmered with the early morning light. At the academy, the morning was quieter, the air carrying the weight of expectation. Nicander walked the familiar path to Plato's gathering place, his mind filled with lingering thoughts from the previous night's discussion. The cool breeze carried with it the scent of olive groves and burning incense from the nearby temples, a reminder of both the divine and the mundane interwoven in daily life. When he arrived, the group was already assembled, their faces marked with contemplation. The rustling of parchment and the occasional clink of a clay cup interrupted the silence, but otherwise, all eyes were fixed on Plato. He stood at the head of the gathering, his presence calm yet commanding. Today, there was no need for questions. The lesson was already unfolding in the silence between them. Plato's gaze rested on Nicander before he spoke. You have all pondered the nature of friendship and the paths we walk to maintain it, he began, his voice steady. But tell me, what happens when a path is abandoned for too long? A murmur of agreement swept through the students. Nicander felt the weight of the question settle in his chest, his thoughts drifting to Philomene's, to the time that had been lost. The space between them had once been bridged by shared laughter and common pursuits, yet neglect had left it barren. He took a breath before answering. The path becomes difficult to find, but not impossible. If both travelers will it, it can be cleared again. Plato nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Indeed. But effort alone is not always enough. Sometimes one must call out to the other, must remind them of the road they once walked together. Silence fell upon the group, the truth of his words hanging in the air. The soft chirping of birds in the distance punctuated the stillness, as if the city itself waited for understanding to bloom. For Nicander, it was a call to action. Friendship was not merely an idea to be discussed, but a journey to be traveled, step by step, even if the way forward was uncertain. He glanced at his fellow students and saw their expressions shift, the lesson resonating within each of them in different ways. As the sun rose higher, the lesson concluded not with a grand proclamation, but with quiet understanding. Nicander knew what he had to do. He turned from the gathering and made his way through the city streets, past the agora and its bustling crowds, past the towering temples and statues of forgotten gods, until he stood once more at Philomene's door. The city pulsed around him, but at this moment he felt suspended in time, standing between past regrets and the possibility of reconciliation. This time, when he knocked, the door opened without hesitation. Philomene's expression was not one of surprise, but of quiet recognition. No words were needed. The path had been found again, not in theory, but in action. The room inside was just as he remembered, scrolls stacked in uneven piles, a cup half filled with wine resting on a wooden table. The scent of ink and aged parchment filled the air. It was a familiar space, one that carried the weight of conversations left unfinished. Philomene's gesture for him to enter, and they sat across from each other as they once had, long ago. At first, their words were few, hesitant like travelers finding their footing on an uncertain road. But as the moment stretched, the ease of old friendship began to take shape again. They spoke of philosophy, of the city, of how time had shaped them both. They laughed at past mistakes, at youthful arrogance, at the realization that even the wisest can falter when it comes to matters of the heart. As the evening stretched on, the oil lamp flickered between them, casting long shadows against the walls lined with parchment. Outside, the streets were alive with the revelry of the city, but in this small space, time moved at its own pace. The air was heavy with nostalgia, yet also with hope. Nicander leaned back slightly, observing his friend with a soft smile. I feared the road had disappeared entirely, he admitted, his voice quiet. That I had left it untended for too long. Philomenes met his gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment before he spoke. Paths are meant to be walked, Nicander. Some become overgrown, but they do not vanish. They only wait. Nicander considered this, the weight of it settling in his chest, but this time it was a comforting weight. What presence of understanding. It was not a single conversation that would mend all wounds, but it was a beginning. And as they shared a quiet toast, the words of Plato echoed in Nicander's mind, "Do not let the grass grow on the path of friendship." The night deepened, and with it came a quiet certainty. The path ahead was not yet fully clear, but it was no longer lost. And that was enough.